I rate we can get started now. I'm gonna do a quick welcome, and then we'll do a round of intros. So welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to come and join us. My name is William Cronje, and I am here on behalf of EduFlow and EduFlow Academy. And the big reason for EduFlow Academy existing is to show people and to work with people to kind of like promote this idea that learning online doesn't have to be just videos and quizzes. It can be so much more interactive and so much more engaging and social, as long as we learn how to use all of these new awesome things that we can do thanks to advances in technology and best practices, I guess. So the topic of today's discussion is about a bit of a dilemma, I guess, that a lot of people who design learning experiences face. And the dilemma is you only have a limited time and budget to make something. And often we have to make sacrifices. We have to decide not to develop this really, really amazing graphic or video or whatever resource intensive thing we want to develop for the sake of the budget or the timeline. And this workshop to some extent is talking about that balance, about form versus function. When can we decide to make something look a bit less visually appealing for the sake of making it more efficient, or putting time into another place where we think it can be more valuable. And to join us in this discussion, we've got Peter and Kryssia, and both of them have some really unique backgrounds and perspectives, and I think that's going to make this session very, very interesting. Can I ask you to introduce yourselves one at a time? Can we start with you, Kryssia?
Oh, hi everyone. My name is Kryssia Kipp, and I'm a country manager at Genially. I don't know if have you ever used this amazing tool to create content and interactive presentations. And thank you, William, for inviting me to this amazing webinar, and along with Peter Shea.
Hi, I'm Peter Shea. I'm an instructional designer by training. Professionally, I've been a director of professional development in higher education for about a decade. And I'm extremely active on social media as a way of creating community practices among instructional and learning designers, because I think traditionally they've often been very isolated, and every professional community grows by talking and chatting with one another. So I'm very interested in generating conversations and helping people share knowledge.
Cool. I also want you to plug your really awesome Facebook group, Peter. Could you tell us about it?
Sure. In 2017, I created a Facebook group for instructional designers who work in education, because that sphere is often very different from corporate instructional design. And in the past 6 years, it's grown to a membership around the world of about 16,000 plus people who have very lively conversations about what they care about in terms of instructional design, what they think the trends are, how to solve challenges. And certainly this group was very active during the COVID period, being responsible for doing the never before achieved goal of moving global higher education into an online space, particularly when there are many people who are reluctant to go into it. So it's been a very interesting 6 years.
Awesome. I've also I shared some links. I shared a link to Genially, where Kryssia works, and to Peter's Facebook group. You're welcome to peruse. Also, before we get started, I just want to invite everyone who is joining us to please engage with us in the discussion in the chat on the side. We'll be keeping an eye out, and if you want to ask any questions throughout the session, we'll try to answer them as we go through, and then we'll also try to leave some time for a Q&A at the end of the session, where we can try to answer any extra questions that we didn't necessarily get to during the conversation. So yeah, ask questions, start your own conversation on the side. We'd love to catch up on what you think about the different topics. So to kick us off, I'm going to start with the first question, which is what is the relationship, in your opinion, between something that looks good and something that teaches something efficiently, or that communicates the learning objectives, or the thing that needs to be taught effectively? Does something have to look good to be able to be effective? And if not, why? Or if so, why? Yeah, I'll leave that over to you.
I'm going to start. So I believe that in order to teach effectively, it is important to combine design with engagement. Even if you have a good looking content, if it does not engage your audience, it will be not effective. So applying interactive visual communication is the best way to turn boring, flat, static content into interesting experience for learners. I believe that with interactive elements, any kind of concept takes less time to explain. So you need less text on the screen, which makes it more possible to create much more visually appealing content. So, for example, animation helps capture the team attention, and interactivity is very effective at getting team members involved. That's what we want. And the person receiving the training will take on an active role when they interact with the content. So this is why they also retain the information better by putting what they learn into practice. And so I believe that this is something to take in mind when we want something, create something that teaches effectively.
For me, aesthetically, the first thing that makes an object beautiful is that it's useful. If something there's a lot of bells and whistles, but it's a distraction, then that's for me a form of ugliness. Unfortunately, in order to sell learning objects to potential clients, often designers will try to create something that has a lot of unnecessary features. And my aesthetic point of reference is the Japanese bento box. I like something minimalist, but does exactly what it needs to do, and in a very clear way. You don't have to explain a bento box. We'll look at it and immediately they get it. So for me, that is the aesthetic object that you want to go to. And part of the obstacle is that often our users don't share our knowledge of effective learning science practices, and it can be very tempting to create things that look cute, but are actually a distraction. And so I try to focus on making something clear. And if someone likes, well, this seems very simple, I'm like, that's what we want to go for. And you can always say, I can make it pretty, but do you want it to be pretty or do you want it to be useful? And if the client is serious about it, they're going to want it to be useful. And if I have to pitch why this is particularly good, I can do that within 2 minutes. And if it's a client worth having, they'll get it. If they don't, it's probably a client I don't want. Trying to explain, a well-designed learning object should sell itself. It should be very clear. One of my favorite books is called The Design of Everyday Things by Robert Norman, which is about design psychology. And it's about both the utility and the form. And, and the form should not confuse the user as to how to use it. I hate things that are designed and I don't know, like a door where I don't know if I'm supposed to push or pull. I hate that. I want to know immediately what I'm supposed to do. And the same goes for learning objects. I want to be able to very quickly get, because, any learning object that makes the user feel stupid, you've already begun to ruin the relationship between the user and the object. The object should not only enable the person to learn, master the knowledge or the skill, but it shouldn't make them feel as though they're less intelligent. So.
Totally agree, Peter.
I actually, we have a question in the chat, which is why not pretty and useful? And I think that's like an interesting challenge, because sometimes we have to make that trade-off where we, for the sake of the budget, we can't necessarily hire a graphic designer. But I think sometimes like just adhering to some basic principles, and Peter kind of hinted toward that. Adhering to the basic principles does make it pretty to some extent. If it makes sense, if like the visual design principles are there, and they've been kind of adhered to, then it just looks good already. So I guess it can be pretty unuseful. But then it also, I guess, goes to what we define as pretty. Is pretty like a beautiful like image that someone hours to put together, or is pretty something that makes sense? You're welcome to add your thoughts there if you'd like.
Yeah, and I'd say to the client, again, I'm not anti-pretty here. To me, a clean design is beautiful. I love, less but more. But if someone keeps insisting on fancier graphics, I'd be inclined to ask them, do you want to learn or do you want to be entertained? Make sure we know what your motivation is here. Because something that is entertaining isn't necessarily something that's promoting learning. And this is something that is unfortunately pervasive in many learning spheres. They feel they have to be entertained in order to learn something, and that's not the case. So you have to clear that away. You have to be engaged to some level, but that's not the same thing as being entertained. So there's some confusion that you all smoke and fog that you have to clear away with clients sometimes.
Yeah, really good point. We actually had a roundtable discussion yesterday with Mo and Tabitha, and they also brought up something similar, which is, especially, so the topic of the conversation was gamification, and gamification can be a really, really effective tool if it's used right. But sometimes when we add all of these visual things, or these mechanics or whatever, they can actually be detrimental to the learning experience. So it's like an interesting balance that we have to have. What I find interesting as well, like in terms of making it easier to make something look good, is like when Genially, for example, has a template that you can use, and the template already has like those visual building blocks. So let's say we've already put together all of our material, and we know exactly what we want to present, and when it comes to how to present it, then platforms and tools we use can sometimes make it a bit easier for us. Kryssia, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that.
Yeah, that's something that I learned genially is you have your template, and you have your presentation, and you have your animation. You can animate, add unlimited animations to your creation and interactiveness. But the thing is that you don't want your audience to get distracted. So you don't need to have like a bunch of animated items right there. So you have to have your purpose and your objective and what you want to accomplish and achieve, and then use your animations correctly. So this is something that we actually put in our academy and our Genial Academy, that you need to design your course first, your guide, and then start using the items and the features with intelligence, I guess.
Awesome. Go ahead, Peter.
I think too is, whenever you add an element, it's supposed to make the user think. And is the user thinking in that moment about what they're supposed to be thinking about? Because sometimes you can well-intentionally add something that causes the user to think, but not about the right things in the right sequence. There's this great story told by the learning scientist Daniel Willingham about consulting with an elementary school that was doing a learning unit about the American history and the Underground Railroad and the anti-slavery movement. And the teacher was going on and on about teaching the students how to make a certain kind of biscuit that was used by people in the Underground Railroad, and she was very pleased with it. And she asked Willingham, do you think it really contributed to the learning experience? And Willingham had to say no. He said, because what are they thinking about? They're thinking about mixing chemicals and baking and temperature. I said, these are not concepts that are strictly related to the core learning objective, which is understanding a historical event. It's very peripheral. So in that instance, the teacher had inadvertently focused on the wrong things by association. And I think that principle can happen a lot in learning design. We focus on something that is peripherally related to the concept that looks interesting. We think this is going to interest people, but if they're thinking about that, they're not thinking about the things they need in order to promote the learning.
Yeah, I really like that you mentioned learning objectives, because I think they are the most underappreciated tools that we have in our arsenal as designers of learning experiences, because and it happens to me very often where like I will have written or designed a learning experience, and then I read through it, and then I realize that that whole paragraph is completely unrelated. And I will have, that means that I wasted time writing that paragraph, and I wasted doing research on to find something that was actually not aligned with what I wanted learners to know. So I think that tool, like writing that learning objective like on the top of the page and sticking to it really, really aggressively can have a really like positive impact, because then it also reduces clutter. You know, it gets rid of that unnecessary stuff that to some extent also can just distract people from what you want them to learn. Really, really important point. Kryssia, I noticed that you unmuted. Did you have a response?
Excuse me?
Did you have a response? Sorry, I noticed that you unmuted.
No. I actually believe that's the same thing that actually Peter Shea said. And it all depends on the objective of the presentation, I guess. That you cannot have everything animated.
Yeah, definitely. Peter, you also unmuted, so you're welcome to jump in.
I just want to say that, you know, I started my career in education as a writing instructor, and that has shaped my thinking going forward. Is the idea is that in effective writing, you don't want any unnecessary element in the sentence. You want everything there that has to be there in order to achieve the objective. Anything else is going to drag it down or be distracting. So you want to be as sparse as possible. And I think, you know, in terms of the design process, it's probably the same thing as drafting a document. In the beginning, you can go crazy and add and put things and anything that you think might be useful. But then in the secondary phase, you have to start thinking like an editor and pruning away everything that isn't strictly relevant to the process. And, you know, like with animations, people like them, but you have to ask yourself, what did the animation add that a solitary image did not? Now, if you could answer that question, then you have a clear rationale.
Awesome. Yeah, these are some really good points. And Michelle just shared in the chat about that phase when everyone was animating everything in PowerPoint. And it was, yeah, and I remember when I was in school, I got praised by my teacher for not having any animations. And that was mostly because I was too lazy to add them in. But I felt like a sense of gratification knowing that these animations were actually like not liked. The next question I think that we're kind of leaning towards already is, so how do you decide to make learners or learning material interactive? So when do you decide to add triggers and animations and stuff like that without compromising the effectiveness or the ability of the learning material to bring about behavioral change or the change that you want that you want to happen?
Do you want me to go first, or?
Yeah, go ahead.
To me, I want learners to be making decisions as quickly as possible. I tend to favor short simulations in my designs because I go back to the principle that learners only learn things when they're actively doing something. Going back to the PowerPoint, you know, my earliest explorations of PowerPoint was to use it as a simulation tool by simply creating hyperlinks between different slides that represented different choices. I thought that was a much more interesting and effective use of PowerPoint than, you know, the spinning god-awful animation things that they threw in for no good reason. So I want the learner to be making interesting decisions as possible. That's what I mean. That's what I think of when I think of meaningful interaction. If it's simply pushing a button, then that's pointless. But when I add an interaction, the user should immediately understand why it's there. In other words, if I'm teaching if I'm trying to create teaching a concept, I should be giving them a series of decisions which clearly relate to that. And even if they don't know the answer, it's forcing them to grapple with the blank spots of their knowledge. So sometimes designing interaction at the very beginning before you've given them any information is a good way of helping them assess their own prior knowledge as they begin to learn a topic.
Kryssia?
I agree with Peter, but I believe that when you want to generate a value with your audience, and if you want to engage, the interaction is your ally. And of course, I believe that if you want to follow a linear structure of your content, so it depends on what you want to achieve. So you use interactivity when you want to increase retention or adherence because you train, you reinforce, and you simulate.
Awesome. Yeah, I actually one like intervention I can share, because often like we want to introduce these interactions to encourage active learning, right? We want them to positively engage and actually do something with what they're learning. And what one of the like most basic examples for me was when I was doing coursework from a master's degree. There was like really dense reading material that I really struggled to understand it, and it was given to me in like a scanned PDF, so I couldn't even it wasn't a PDF, it was like almost like image, so you can't highlight the text and put it into like a reader to make it a bit easier to like just to read it to you. So maybe that would have helped. But what like the simple intervention that made it so much easier for me to digest this learning material was just a question that the lecturers would give me before I started reading. You know, they said, before you start reading, try to answer these questions while you are reading. And that simple intervention had such a big impact on my ability to digest, because I was looking for something and I was almost primed to focus on something before I started, and that made that very like difficult to understand material somehow easier because I knew what to focus on. I think that's where interactivity can also be really handy, is if it's when we put it in there to really encourage people to focus on something that is important. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else would like to jump in and share anything about that.
You know that I had an interview with Robin Sargent, and I love her. I love that woman. And she says something interesting, that she likes interactivity because she puts their audience like to practice with their content. So they retain the information and they understand better what they are actually learning at the moment. So I really like what she said, because this is why we use interactivity. It's not, I'm gonna put interactivity to everything. It's very specific with what I want them to learn. And it's incredible.
Definitely. Awesome. And I think this is another kind of like off the cuff question, but where do you think learner analysis, or like the analysis phase of your instructional design process, like where does that getting to know your learner process fit in to when you decide to, or how you decide to add interactivity or to add in all the bells and whistles? Would anyone like to share any ideas about that?
Sorry, so your question was, when do you
so to what extent do you consider the learners, so you know your analysis of your learners when it comes to building these experiences?
Well, that, I mean, again, everything, it seems to me, goes back to my training as a writing instructor, and you know, audience is always important. It was one of the first concepts I emphasize to students, that you're never just writing to anybody, you're always writing to somebody, and that knowledge of that somebody should influence what you're saying and how you're saying it. So yes, you know, I like to know as much about the learners as I can. Sometimes it's such a large group that, you know, it could be people who work in an organization, so there's not much I can tell about their individual learning preferences. Although I try to keep in mind that I want to add as many effective modalities as possible, because I do know that people prefer different modalities, even though they can learn through any modality. You know, I often don't have as much data as I'd like to. But when I'm designing something for a specific individual I know well, that's when I feel super confident. because I really know I mean, when I design things with like my son in mind, that's the easiest job in the world. And I wish it was always like that. But to a certain degree, I think we're flying in the dark. We can have certain generic qualities that we're aware of, but we may just make certain assumptions, particularly about adult learners, and that they're, you know, motivated to study the material.
Generally, one of the best things that we have is that we track information. Like you can track your Genially and the activity on your Genially, and it is incredible because we learn from the experience that the user had on the platform. But the bad thing is that how many times she or he spent on that slide. So if she or he learn played with that specific, I don't know, gamification, interactivity. And so we can get all that information and data, and they can create more experience that they can be helpful for the audience.
You just want to add to that.
Go ahead, Peter.
That's a great point. That's a great observation. And I think, you know, creating, I'm really in favor of learning tools that track learner behavior in the active while they're going through it. I mean, again, my early fascination with simulations was that they would track not only the mistakes people made, but how quickly they made them, and that's really wonderful data. My dream tool is for people who have already mastered, studied it at some point, but just want to be refreshed. And this tool would occasionally send them little challenges related to the content area, you know, say business. And they would make the decision, and the decision was either correct or incorrect. If it was incorrect, they get feedback. But more importantly, the system would record the areas where their knowledge seemed to decay, which over time, if you have enough data set, you could track which concepts in a particular content area decay more quickly than others. So if you're tracking, say, 100 business students, after they've completed a course at a university and they've all gotten, you know, they all got passing grades, and then over a 6-month period, you're seeing what they got right and what they got wrong on these random prompts, you can say, this particular concept seems to decay much faster. Maybe then we need to go back and not only reteach it in a different way, but create post-course supplementary materials that people can go into to refresh, like a sort of mental gym. Because one of the things I learned when I was working in a medical college is that for student doctors, not only is there's a tremendous volume of information they have to memorize, but unfortunately, they don't get to apply a lot of it frequently. So when the moment arises that they need to use it, it can be a little nerve-wracking because they're thinking, I studied this 2.5 years ago. I got a good grade. I can't remember anything. That's why they had the simulation lab, because they were constantly sending students in there to practice concepts they weren't getting experience of in the operating room, just so they'd be refreshed. And I'm a great believer in that we haven't done enough about learning for retrieval as opposed to learning for initial mastery. And we have the tools now. We can really do great things, but it's hard to get our mind around it because it's so different from what we've traditionally done.
Kryssia, go ahead.
I just want to tell Peter I'm taking notes of everything that he is saying about his dream tool.
Hopefully, Genially will start sending learners refresher, like timely refreshers.
I keep saying that could be really cool. I want.
No. I'm coding everything, recording and coding everything.
This is great.
Yeah, I think it's a great. I mean, because we're so obsessed. It's funny. We have this tremendous blind spot. It's all about the initial learning, but we're all professionals in a world where we have to remember things. Why is nobody in the remembering business?
Yeah, I'm actually this report to my university time and college time, and it's true. I'm an instructional designer, I have to say, but it is totally interesting what you're saying. I'm going to take notes and send it to you.
Awesome. I'm actually like following up on what Peter's mentioned. I'd love to like see an analysis of the Genially data, or not Genially, Duolingo, because I can imagine they must have the most amazing information about how people forget and what they forget. And I can only imagine if you like mix in some AI algorithm with the enormous amount of information they could probably like tell us a lot about how people learn at least language, but I'm sure a lot of that stuff could translate to other fields. You mentioned, like this idea of using data, and I think one of the luxuries, but one of the really nice parts of like reasons, or how can I say it, features of designing courses in my context, is that I can iterate pretty easily. Like I can make a change, add a new video to a course based on feedback that I collect from the formative assessments or from the learning data that we pick up on Eduflow. And it really means that we can start by creating, I usually like to call it the minimum viable accessible product, like something that is like ready to go, it's accessible. It might just be like 90% text, but we can ship it and then start collecting feedback, and then we know like where we need to improve based on where people are getting stuck and where we're collecting feedback. Obviously, it's a bit of a high risk, it's not, you can't necessarily use it in every context. Like I wouldn't use that approach if I was training pilots for for airliners or whatever, because that might be a bit risky. But in some of the like less risky places, that could be like a really effective approach. Peter, I see you unmuted.
I was just thinking what you just said about the pilots and everything. I have a rule in learning. It goes like this. It's you will always find the most powerful learning tools in those domains where people are making existential decisions. The most cutting edge learning tools are always found in the military, aviation, and medicine, because people cannot afford to make mistakes. And I always thought, okay, when we know these tools are so powerful, why aren't we using them in other domains? I started using writing simulations that I created 20 years ago to help students make decisions in the act of making writing without making mistakes that would make them feel awkward. So they would simply make a decision in the writing simulation and then defend the choice, and it freed them. And the idea is, if these tools are so powerful, why aren't we using them in other domains? And just on a quickly, I don't know about learning data. A couple of years ago, Amazon hired Candace Steele, who was a learning scientist rock star at Stanford. And I've always wondered about that, because things went very quiet after Candace, I think, went to Amazon. And I'm thinking to myself, Amazon isn't hiring someone that smart just to build a training program. I can't help think there's a Project X somewhere behind there at Amazon, looking at their data knowledge, learning science knowledge, and figuring out how to build something really wickedly good in terms of tracking learning data. That's my theory. I suspect there's something going on there, because I mean, when you combine those two areas of knowledge and you have the means to build really interesting tools, they could easily dominate various learning markets that way.
Yeah, I think the next few years, I think will be very interesting. It might be terrible of me to bring this up, but with generative AI coming into the fold, it means that we'll have like a little superpower that we have to use very wisely, and it can be very effective if we use it right. But I think in terms of even in terms of like the way people are building platforms nowadays, or building these tools we're going to use, like they're going to be able to make them much faster and introduce all these cool things much quicker. But I think the important thing is that they are built thoughtfully and well, instead of just kind of like what we were touching on earlier, which is like just introducing junk. We don't want junk features everywhere. We want something that's there for a reason whenever we design something. Yeah, so I think maybe I can jump into the next question, unless Peter or Kryssia, you'd like to add anything to that. Oh, Mo actually just shared that you can now make fully interactive e-learning lessons with AI. Mo, can I unmute you, and then do you want to share that quickly?
Hey guys. Yeah, it's a tool called Knowledge, Knowledge. Yeah, I'm on the beta list right now. Well, anyone can be on the beta list, and supposedly you can give them a YouTube video or PDFs or any form of documents, and they can just turn it into an e-learning lesson with all the bells and whistles.
Wow.
So yeah, you can check the video on YouTube. Yeah, they have like a 2-3 minute video introduction to the whole thing. I'm skeptical. I don't think it's gonna work fully the way we want it, but you know, I appreciate the shortcut for now.
I think that'll be like yeah, I think like soon there's going to be a lot of like junk that we're going to have to wade through. And like, I think that tool could be a really nice brainstorming tool, but then we still have to be very thoughtful about how we, edit, I guess, and what we add and where we decide to introduce that interactivity, because the AI might think that this is a nice place to add interactivity, but it might be like, doesn't really make sense.
To me, they're all not really tools that I can depend on for e-learning or learning, but they're good tools for practice, brainstorming, and sometimes they can offer really good shortcuts to some dev work, but I won't depend on it to be a final product.
I guess this leads us to the next question. Thanks so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. Good to see you 2 days in a row. That's awesome.
Likewise.
So the next thing that we can maybe chat about is your workflows. So as like when you are designing learning experiences, what is your process? Let's say you're on a time crunch and you have to make something that works, that communicates something, or that teaches someone something or solves a specific problem. What is your process for creating something that's cohesive and hopefully that looks good and is effective? Would Peter or Kryssia, would you like to share?
Well, as I said, I'm not an instructional designer, but I spoke with one of our instructional designers that actually designed the academy, the Genial Academy. And one of the things that she said to me is that we need to know and understand our clients, and learning from their feedbacks is important. She also said that we also should understand their needs and then give our audience an appropriate visual design that they even want to interact with. So actually, we have an amazing information at our online academy. We not only train people about our product, but about training too. So it is important to be clear again about the objective of the experience if we want to engage or motivate. As Peter said before, motivation is something that we need to be clear on the purpose of the course or the presentation.
Yeah, I really I like those nuggets, and I think this is probably a really good moment to promote Genially, because I think one of the shortcuts that Genially offers is that you've got those pre-made templates. It's already a way to automatically bring in a visual style guide, or something that has it gets rid of a lot of the initial process and the headaches of the design phase, where you have to decide which colors I'm going to use, where am I going to put all my buttons and whatever.
It helps you maximize your time. With Genially, you can choose from a wide selection of templates that are easy to navigate. That is important, and it really helps to maximize your time when creating a visual appealing presentation. So you don't have to spend time of all of the design process, just as to achieve the purpose and how you're going to accomplish it.
Awesome. Peter.
I like to start with an interesting problem. A couple of years ago, I was designing some fire science lessons for college students who were studying fire science, and I was working with a professional firefighter. And I always say, what mistakes do novices make when they're in the field? And we just had a ball listing all the things, all the mistakes that people would make. And then designing little scenarios where they have to go through it and then, watch them as they make the mistakes. And that would in turn follow into a conversation about what the novices were thinking about. And again, I like tools. I like designing tools that not only give an individual user an interesting challenge, but will spur a conversation afterwards with other people, because I really do believe that the social learning aspect is critical. And you remember those things. I think they also lead to long-term behavioral change. I'm always fascinated by any learning experience which is sticky, so that years later I can only remember it, but I can apply it in new contexts. I had a friend who designed a learning game around teaching young employees how to work in retail, and I was testing it out for him. And one of the things that the avatars had to do was pick up clothing on the floor and fold it again and put it back and make sure it looked presentable, and just do it over and over again. And then a few weeks later, I was in a grocery store, and something like a cantaloupe had fallen to the ground, and I just, without thinking, picked it up, polished it, and put it back on the thing. And I just was like, okay, that was effective. There was behavioral change there. But yeah, I like to start like, if I was studying this, what would grab my attention? What would be interesting? So I always start with that. So, what story can I build around the initial challenges? Because I think that one of the biggest motivating things for any learner is acquiring knowledge or skill that makes them feel more powerful in the world itself, and that makes them feel like, they can do something. Because I think the bane of too much academic studying is you acquire a lot of learning to know, but not enough learning to do. And I think if you make people feel they're going to be able to do something and design it in the initial phases, that's a good start.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And I think that's why there's such a big focus on performance in instructional design. Like, what do you want people to do after they've left your training experience? You mentioned earlier, or you've spoken a few times about simulations, and I think there's probably a lot we can learn from you in terms of simulations, and firstly, maybe a bit about what they are and how you like to use them. Would you like to share? I know this is putting you on the spot, but would you like to share some basic information about simulations and short simulations, and why you enjoy using them so much?
Well, like I said earlier, one of the key moments early in my career was working at a medical college next to a simulation lab. And I come from a very conventional educational background. It was very lecture based and everything like that. And working next to the lab and observing people going in and out of it really made me realize, wow, this is why didn't we have this before? I remember one day being in my office and I was hearing crying, and I asked what happened, and they told me the medical students are taking their final exam in the simulation lab, and one of the students killed her virtual patient. And I didn't know whether to laugh or to feel bad for the person. But then I thought to me, that's one student doctor who will never make that mistake. And that's when I realized the emotional impact of a powerfully built simulation. And then I realized, well, why isn't simulation-based learning used in other domains? And it was because our conception of simulation was these highly expensive machines, and you didn't need that. A simple interactive choose your own adventure text and picture design is sufficient to create a meaningful simulation experience. So I began working in that domain about 20 years ago, and I began with traditional academic topics. And I certainly follow the work of Clark Aldrich, who's really led the way in terms of the design of short simulations. And I think that's a really tremendously underused medium in our field. Again, because culturally we're so attuned, even instructional designers are still attuned to the information delivery model. And it's hard for us to get out of. It's like the people in the last generation of horse-based transportation. We've seen cars, but we can't get the horse out of our head. And I think that's the way it is with simulations. And I think, going forward, textbooks should all be interactive with simulation. In other words, if I'm reading a textbook on economics, by the end of that chapter, I should be able to click on a link that takes me to an application of that problem and then go through it. And even if I fail, the very fact that I'm grappling with the knowledge is going to really make certain that I have a better chance of grasping the material overall. We have the means to do that, but we're still we still have a very 20th century model in our head, even those of us who have been advocating for innovation. It's really going to take a generational break to get out of that. And the other thing too is the phone. I mean, the phone is some of the most valuable learning real estate there is, and yet we've designed so little for mobile learning. And when you work in a city like I do outside of Boston, you see a lot of students riding on public transportation and they're on their phone there all the time. Well, why haven't our colleges designed something for them to do on their phone in between, you know, there are these wonderful fugitive moments in a person's day when they can be studying a topic. And I don't just mean informationally, I mean doing something meaningfully interactive. And yet we know how powerful it is, but we haven't gotten there yet, you know. So I'm hoping in the next few years we're going to see more and more like that. And going to your earlier point, you're right. In the early phases, you see a lot of junk. I mean, the field is cluttered. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the pre-YouTube period of video on the web. It wasn't pretty. There were all these plugins you had to install, but sooner or later, someone got it right. And one of my dreams is to have a giant library of interactive challenges that people can go into on their own and just play with them. I mean, we have text-based libraries, we have video libraries. What we need now is a great library of interactive tools. And that when that happens and when people are using it on a mass scale, then they'll have the aha moment publicly, you know.
That's really cool. Thank you so much for sharing. Kryssia, you also shared in the chat that you had an interview with Robin about this. Would you like to share what you spoke about?
Well, actually, it was about the last topic about how the perfect method, the perfect recipe, how to design an effectively course. So I shared the interview if someone wants to watch it. Very interesting.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think what Peter said really resonated with me, and I think that that's why hopefully by having conversations like this we start promoting this idea that, and I guess that goes all the way back to what I mentioned earlier, where we have to start challenging the conventions of what people think learning is, especially online. And I think often there are these conventions and structures that are difficult to push back against, you know, because, you know, higher education always has this, like, you do some work and then you write an exam at the end. And what if we don't have to write an exam? What if all of the assessment is formative going throughout? You know, like I think there are a lot of different ways that we can challenge the conventions, and through challenging the conventions, we start choosing the right tool for the appropriate context to, you know, meet the learners where they need to be met and give them the right things that they need to know. So I think that that really stuck with me. We've got a few minutes left, and I think I want to leave some time for anyone in the chat to ask us questions. So you're welcome to type it into the chat, or you can put up your hand and ask away, and then I'll let you unmute, and then you can share your question. In the meantime, I'll also look for a question that someone asked earlier, which is, how might you balance an approach between knowing what's expected of your learner and a discovery-based learning concept? I don't know if the person who wrote that would like to quickly unmute and let us know. I didn't write down the name of the person who wrote that down, unfortunately. So you're welcome to, if you want to add some more context to that question, you can raise your hand, or you can just add some more information. A discovery-based learning concept is quite an interesting, and I guess that maybe talks a bit about this idea of simulations, you know, like project-based learning or discovery-based learning, where we kind of like give them a bit more freedom and agency to find the answers themselves. Maybe ask something a bit more thought-provoking at the beginning. But if, yeah. Cool. Yeah, giving learners more agency. Yeah, that's also another way that we can break that mold of what learning is. Peter, go ahead.
That's a great point. It's because our traditional model deprives the learner of agency. I mean, again, I always remember Paulo Freire's banking model of learning, where you're sitting there passively and the instructor is just depositing knowledge into your head. And the other thing too is that does not, I mean, it had one of the unforeseen effects of that model, even though it's bureaucratically efficient to put people in a room and just throw information at them, is that they grow up with very little agency, and there's an almost passivity to it. And I've always been struck by the fact that the classroom model that we have is largely inherited from 19th century Germans in Prussia. This idea that you just sit and you listen, which is very Germanic, to listen to the authority. But then I realized that in the later part of the 19th century, the same Germans pioneered the modern war game. And I always thought it was funny that the Germans, for whom we acquired this passive learning model, when they found something they really wanted to be good at, making war, they turned to interactive and games. So I think there's something very revealing in that historical fact. But again, yeah, I came out of 12 years of K-12 and 4 years of university, and I went out into the world, and I didn't know what to do unless somebody gave me an assignment. So yes, I do think there is a very important need to create more to teach agency much sooner and much more vigorously, in order if you really want to make active citizens and people that are mentally healthy, because they feel, they sense their own agency. They realize they can make decisions and have an impact in the world rather than waiting for someone to tell them what to do. So I think psychologically, apart from pedagogically, psychologically, that's very, very important for us. And that goes again to the value of these decision-based learning tools.
That's really cool. Yeah, I guess, and for me personally, that was like a really big thing, because I feel like I was raised to be a recipient of knowledge, not to actively seek it out. And it's something that, especially when I left high school, where all of a sudden you have all the freedom and agency in the world, but you don't know how to use it responsibly. So you skip class and you don't know what, like you don't know how to self-regulate. And I think that's where, like, teaching this paradigm of what you learn is your responsibility as a learner, and teaching that paradigm early is really important, because it's a lifelong skill that you'll take with you everywhere. And maybe we should end the session on that note, unless Peter or Kryssia, you'd like to add anything, and then we'll go into the closing remarks.
I would just add that, as I've said to William in the past, I'm a curricular Lutheran. I think our traditional way of doing things is many ways beyond reform. So we have to, rather than try to reform the systems we're in, break away and create new ones. And I think it's now more possible than ever before. I think we are no longer dependent on formal institutions for our learning. And I think the most effective learners are realizing this early on and taking the initiative to take charge of their own learning. I think that's a very important development.
Awesome. Kryssia, do you have any closing remarks?
Yes, it is very interesting, all the information and all the things behind the instructional design as a tool, as a work genially. I believe that this is a tool that can help you to create an interactive and animated content, but that can help you accomplish the objective that you want to achieve and get results that is important. Moreover, we have amazing templates and gamification experience that you can add to your course. It is amazing because we also have a SCORM. You can download as a SCORM format. You can track, as I said before, the activity of your audience. So it helps you to understand better what are your audience needs in order to create another course after that. So I'm glad to be here. It is a pleasure. I learned a lot from Peter, from William, and from all of you. And if you have any comments, any questions about Genially, please feel free to contact me on LinkedIn as well. Thank
Cool.
you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. That was great. It's been a great chatting.
Thank you so much, Peter and Kryssia, for your time, and thank you for the 40 plus people who shared this time with us as well. In the chat, I shared a few links to Genially and to various social media platforms, and to Peter's Facebook group that you can sign up and follow and join. I've had the pleasure of trying out Genially, and it's a really cool platform. Definitely check it out, and join Peter's Facebook group. It is really fun, and Peter always shares really interesting and relevant material, blog posts and research papers and stuff like that. I always learn something new when I read stuff that Peter shared. So yeah, thank you again for your time. And for those of you here, we'll be taking the workshop recording, turning it into a little mini follow-up course on EduFlow, and we'll send you a link, and then you can watch it all over again and do some other extra activities, and ask questions and stuff like that.
Thank you so much, William, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right. Yeah. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.